Open those doors. Where is my groom?
Lady Hail, Lord Ashdown fled before dawn.
Fled with whom? Why were you waiting here?
I wasn't.
Then why are you here?
Because a dead woman wrote to me the week your engagement was announced.
The royal chapel of Ashmere smelled of white lilies and candle wax.
The bells were already ringing when Marcella Hail realized the groom was not coming. That the man she had promised her life to had chosen scandal over her, in front of 300 witnesses, in front of the crown itself. And in the stunned silence that followed, a stranger in a black coat rose from the last pew, walked the length of the aisle, and said 4 words that would burn through royal society for years. "Marry me instead. Welcome back to the Royal Duke Diaries. If forbidden vows and dangerous dukes make your heart race, stay close, because this one doesn't let go. Let's begin." The royal chapel of Ashmere smelled of white lilies and candle wax, and Marcella Hail had never felt so much like a painting hung in the wrong room. She stood at the altar in a gown that had cost more than her father's entire estate, her gloved hands trembling around a bouquet of orchids, her eyes fixed on the carved doors at the end of the aisle. Behind her, 300 guests rustled in their seats, dukes, countesses, foreign dignitaries, the king's own cousin seated in the second row with his chin lifted like he was already composing the toast. Her groom was Lord Percival Ashdown, second son of the Earl of Renwick, a man with an easy laugh and wandering eyes that she had told herself, for 11 months, she did not notice. The doors did not open. The bishop cleared his throat. The organist, uncertain, let the final chord of the processional die into silence. Somewhere near the back, a woman whispered something sharp, and the whisper spread like a struck match through dry grass. Marcella kept her spine straight. She had learned long ago that the moment you let your shoulders fall, the room decided you had already lost. Then the side door, the private one, reserved for clergy, opened, and Lord Percival's cousin, white-faced and breathless, hurried to the bishop and murmured something no one else could hear. The bishop's expression did not change, which was somehow worse than if it had. "Lady Hail," the bishop said quietly, so only she could hear, "Lord Ashdown will not be coming." The words did not land all at once. They arrived like a slow, cold tide. First the hands, then the chest, then the throat. He had left. On their wedding day, in front of the crown, Percival Ashdown had simply left. Later it would come out that he'd boarded a private carriage that morning with a mistress from the opera and a fortune in his late mother's jewels, choosing ruin and pleasure over duty and her. The whisper became a wave. Fans opened. Someone laughed, an ugly, delighted sound, quickly smothered. Marcella felt 300 pairs of eyes catalogue her humiliation, felt the particular cruelty of a room that had come dressed for a celebration and was about to leave with a story instead. She did not cry. She had promised herself, standing in this same chapel an hour earlier, that whatever happened, she would not give them her tears. It was then that she heard the second set of footsteps. They were unhurried, measured. A man's boots on stone moving with the calm certainty of someone who had never once needed to rush toward anything in his life. Marcella turned, along with every other head in the chapel, and found Duke Julian Westwood walking down the aisle she had just been abandoned in. She knew him only by reputation. The quiet Duke, they called him, though not out of kindness. He rarely attended balls. He spoke to almost no one at the events he could not avoid. His family's holdings stretched across 4 counties, and it was whispered, though never confirmed, that half of Parliament owed him something they would rather forget. He was 31, unmarried, and the subject of more speculation than any man his age had a right to survive. He stopped in front of her. Up close, his eyes were gray, so pale they looked almost silver in the candlelight, and they were fixed on her with an attention so complete it felt like being the only person left standing in the room. "Your Grace," Marcella managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "This is hardly the moment for, I am aware of exactly what moment this is," Julian said, quiet enough that only she and the bishop could hear. "That is why I am here. I don't understand." "You don't need to, not yet." He glanced once at the bishop, whose face had gone through several rapid and undignified changes of expression. "Is the license already drawn for a marriage in this chapel, today, before witnesses?" "It is, Your Grace, but the groom is a fool who does not deserve the paper his name was written on." Julian's voice did not rise, but something in it made the bishop go very still. "I am offering to sign it instead, if Lady Hail is willing." The chapel had gone utterly silent, the earlier whispers swallowed by something closer to disbelief. Marcella stared at him, certain she had misheard, certain this was some cruel continuation of the morning's humiliation. "You cannot be serious," she said. "I am rarely anything else." Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite warmth, but the shape of where warmth might one day live. "You came here today prepared to bind your life to a man in front of everyone who matters in this kingdom. I am not asking you to love me, Lady Hail. I am asking you to let me spare you a humiliation that was never yours to carry in the first place." Marcella's mind raced through every reasonable objection, that she did not know him, that this was madness, that marrying a stranger to escape one scandal only invited another. But she thought, too, of the whispers already spreading through the pews, of the newspapers that would print her name beside the word jilted for the rest of the season, of her father's face when he learned his family's name had become a joke told at other people's dinner tables. "Why?" she asked, the only question that mattered. "Why would you do this?" Julian held her gaze. "Because I have watched you across 3 ballrooms this season, Lady Hail, and in every one of them you were the only person in the room who did not seem to be performing. Brief, but deliberate. And because Percival Ashdown does not deserve what he was about to have, it should not have been enough. It should have sounded like madness dressed in a duke's calm voice. But something in her, something exhausted from years of careful smiles and careful silence, recognized the offer for what it was. A door, opened by a stranger, in a room that had just tried to close every other one. "Very well," she said, and her voice did not shake. "Your Grace." The bishop, to his credit, recovered admirably fast. Within the hour, the license had been amended. The guests, stunned into a silence more absolute than any sermon could have produced, had been asked to remain, and Marcella Hail walked back down the aisle she had walked down twice already that morning. This time, as the bride of a duke, no one in that chapel had ever seen smile. The carriage that carried them from the chapel was black lacquer with the Westwood crest on the door, and it was, Marcella thought, the first quiet she had experienced all day. Julian sat across from her, his hands folded, watching the London streets slide past the window, rather than watching her, which she found she was grateful for. "You don't have to show gratitude," he said finally, without turning his head. "I imagine you are furious, frightened, and exhausted in roughly equal measure. That is an unnervingly accurate summary, Your Grace." "Julian," he said, "if we are married, you may as well use my name." She studied him in the dim carriage light, the sharp line of his jaw, the stillness that seemed to be less a performance, and more simply the way he was built. "Why did you truly do it?" she asked again. The real answer this time, not the one for the bishop. For a long moment he said nothing, and she thought he might not answer at all. Then, "Because I have spent a great deal of my life being told that dukes do not act on impulse, that every decision must serve the estate, the title, the family name. Today, for the first time in longer than I can recall, I saw something happening to someone who did not deserve it, and I had the power to stop it. I did not think beyond that. That's not an answer about me. That's an answer about you." Something shifted in his expression. Surprised, she thought, that she had caught the distinction. "You're right," he said. "It is." The carriage rolled on. Neither of them spoke again until it turned through the iron gates of Westwood House, and Marcella looked up at the pale stone facade of the home that was now, impossibly, hers. The next morning the newspapers did exactly what she had feared and exactly what Julian had apparently anticipated. Duke of Westwood weds jilted bride at the altar, read the boldest of them, and beneath it, in smaller print, a detail that made Marcella's stomach turn. Word had already reached the papers that Percival Ashdown had fled not merely with a mistress, but with debts so severe that his family's estate was, by nightfall, rumored to be facing seizure by the Crown. "He ruined himself," Julian said over breakfast, sliding the paper toward her without comment, "quite thoroughly and quite publicly. You need not feel any grief on his account." "I feel none," Marcella said, and was startled to find it true. What she felt instead, sitting in the vast, quiet breakfast room of a house she did not yet understand, was something closer to disbelief at the sheer velocity of her own life's turning. "There is something you should know," Julian said, setting down his cup with careful precision. "My fortune, the one the papers are so delighted to mention, did not come from Ashdown's ruin, but it will be read that way. Every creditor he owed will now look to me, imagining some rivalry settled by marriage rather than coincidence. It will follow us both." "Was it a coincidence?" Marcella asked, watching him closely. Julian met her eyes without flinching. "That is a longer conversation," he said. and not one for a breakfast table on your first morning as my wife. It was, she would come to understand, the first of several answers that were not quite answers at all, small, deliberate gaps in a man who otherwise gave the impression of complete control. She let it go that morning. She would not always be able to. A few days later, Westwood House began to feel less like a stranger's residence, and more like the outline of a life Marcella was slowly being asked to fill in. Julian was, as his reputation promised, quiet, but not cold, she was learning. He ate breakfast with her each morning without fail, asked after her comfort with a specificity that suggested he actually wanted the answer, and disappeared for hours into his study, where, gathered from the servants' careful silence, he conducted business that made grown men nervous to enter the room. His Grace does not raise his voice, the housekeeper, Mrs. Aldous, told her one afternoon, folding linens with brisk efficiency. He has never needed to. Men leave that study paler than when they entered, and not a single word louder than this conversation has ever been spoken inside it. That sounds ominous, Marcella said. It sounds like power, my lady, Mrs. Aldous corrected gently. There's a difference, though London does like to confuse the two. It was during one of these quiet afternoons, wandering the East Wing's long gallery of Westwood ancestors, that Marcella first noticed the portrait that did not belong. It hung at the gallery's far end, half-shadowed, of a young woman with dark hair, and an expression too knowing for the delicate brushwork around it. Unlike the other portraits, this one bore no brass plate with a name. "Who is she?" Marcella asked that evening over dinner, watching Julian's face carefully as she said it. The change was small, barely a flicker, but she caught it. His fork paused above his plate for exactly one beat too long. "No one of consequence," he said, and returned to his meal. It was, Marcella thought, the least convincing thing he had said to her yet. That night, unable to sleep, she returned to the gallery alone, candle in hand, and stood before the portrait longer than was sensible. The woman's eyes seemed to follow the light. There was something in the set of her mouth, a private amusement, or perhaps a private grief, that made Marcella feel, absurdly, as though she were intruding on a conversation that had started long before she arrived and had never properly ended. "You shouldn't be here alone," she startled, nearly dropping the candle. Julian stood in the gallery doorway, dressed still in his evening clothes, his expression unreadable in the low light. "I couldn't sleep," she said, "and I find I am curious about the woman you claim is no one of consequence." He was quiet for a long moment, moving to stand beside her, his gaze fixed on the same portrait. "Her name was Isolde," he said finally, so low she had to strain to hear it, "and she has been dead for 3 years. "Then why does it feel," Marcella asked carefully, watching his face, "as though you're not entirely certain of that?" Julian turned to look at her then, and for the first time since the chapel, something in his composed, careful expression cracked entirely open. Not warmth this time, but something closer to fear. "Because 3 weeks ago," he said quietly, "I received a letter in her handwriting." The words hung in the candlelit gallery like something too fragile to touch. Marcella felt the cold of the stone floor through her slippers, felt the portrait's painted eyes watching them both. "A letter," she repeated, "from a woman who is dead." "I have told no one," Julian said. "Not my solicitor, not my sister, no one but you, and I do not entirely know why I have told you now, except that you asked the question honestly, and I find I am tired of answering everything else dishonestly." He exhaled, a long, controlled breath that did nothing to hide the tension beneath it. "I do not know if it is truly from her. I do not know if it is a cruelty from someone who knew her, or something far worse. But it arrived the same week Percival Ashdown's engagement to you was announced in the papers, and I have not yet decided whether that timing is coincidence." Marcella's pulse quickened, not with fear exactly, but with the particular unease of standing at the edge of a story much larger than the one she had agreed to marry into. "Who was she to you?" Julian's jaw tightened. "That," he said, "is the longer conversation I mentioned at breakfast." He did not offer it that night. But as they walked back through the darkened halls of Westwood House, his hand hovering, not quite touching, at the small of her back, Marcella understood 2 things with sudden, absolute clarity: that she had married a man carrying a secret far heavier than a scandal in the papers, and that despite every reasonable instinct telling her to be afraid, she wanted, more than almost anything, to be the person he finally told the whole truth to. By the end of the week, the season's gossip had shifted, as gossip always did, toward whatever scandal was freshest, and the freshest scandal, unfortunately, involved Marcella and Julian directly. Lady Cecilia Thorne, a widow with sharp eyes and sharper ambitions, had made no secret over the past year of her own hopes regarding the Duke of Westwood, and she arrived at Westwood House 3 days after the wedding with a calling card and an expression of concentrated, glittering displeasure. "Duchess," she said, the title delivered with just enough emphasis to make it sound like an accusation, as Marcella received her in the drawing-room. "How very sudden your happiness has been." "Some happiness arrives suddenly," Marcella replied, keeping her tone light despite the tightening in her chest. "I understand that's rather the nature of the word." Cecilia's smile did not reach her eyes. "I only mean to say, the Duke has never been an impulsive man. Not in business, not in society, not, I confess, in matters of the heart. One wonders what precisely inspired such uncharacteristic haste. Perhaps," Marcella said, "he simply recognized what he wanted and saw no reason to delay in claiming it." It was a bold thing to say, bolder than she felt, but she watched something flicker across Cecilia's composed face, surprise, and beneath it, something colder. "How fortunate for you," Cecilia said, rising to leave, "that he moves so quickly when it suits him." At the door, she paused. "Do give my regards to his Grace, and do ask him," she added, almost as an afterthought, whether he ever found the resolution he was looking for regarding Isolde. She left before Marcella could respond, the name landing in the quiet drawing-room like a struck bell. That evening, Marcella did not wait for a private moment. She found Julian in his study, the door uncharacteristically open, and repeated Cecilia's parting words exactly as they had been spoken. Julian went very still. "Cecilia knows nothing of substance," he said, though his voice had lost some of its usual composure. "She knows there was a woman named Isolde who mattered to me once. She does not know the rest, because I have told no one the rest." "Then tell me," Marcella said, closing the door behind her. "All of it. Not the version for breakfast tables, not the version for bishops. I did not marry you for love, Julian. We both know that. But I will not spend the rest of my life standing in rooms where other people know more about my husband than I do." For a long moment, he simply looked at her. Really looked. The way he had looked at her once across a ballroom she hadn't known he'd been watching from. Then he gestured to the chair across from his desk, and as she sat, he began at last to speak. "Isolde Marchetti was the daughter of an Italian merchant my father did considerable business with," he said. "I met her when I was 24, and I loved her, genuinely, completely, in a way I did not think myself capable of, given how I was raised. We were engaged in secret, because my father would never have approved a match with no title behind it, and we planned to marry the moment I came into my inheritance and could no longer be controlled." "What happened?" "She died," Julian said, 3 years ago, in a fire at her family's townhouse in Bath. I was told the news by letter 3 days after the fire, because I was traveling on an estate business and could not be reached in time. I did not see her buried. I have never seen her grave, because by the time I arrived in Bath, her family had already left England entirely, grief-stricken, and I was told there was nothing left to see." He paused, and something raw moved across his face. "I have spent 3 years believing I failed her twice, once by not being there, and once by never being permitted to properly mourn her. And the letter," Marcella said quietly, "the one that arrived 3 weeks ago, was in her hand," Julian said. "Or a hand so like it that I have not slept properly since receiving it. It said only this: 'You were not the only one who was told a lie.'" The study was silent, except for the low crack of the fire. Marcella felt the full weight of what he had just handed her, not merely a secret, but the unresolved center of a grief he had carried for 3 years without ever being permitted to close it. "Do you think she's alive?" she asked. "I think," Julian said slowly, "that I do not know anything anymore with the certainty I once did. And I think that is precisely why, when I saw you standing alone in that chapel, abandoned by a man who did not deserve you, something in me refused to let another woman be discarded and lied to in the same season." He met her eyes. "I am not comparing you to a ghost, Marcella. I am telling you that I recognize, better than most men could, exactly what it costs to be left standing somewhere you should never have had to stand alone." It was, Marcella realized, the most honest thing anyone had said to her in longer than she could remember, and it terrified her exactly as much as it moved her, because for the first time since the chapel doors had failed to open, she understood that the marriage she had entered as an escape had, without her permission, begun to feel like something else entirely. The following morning, a second letter arrived at Westwood House. No return address, the handwriting achingly familiar to Julian, who went white reading it at the breakfast table before handing it wordlessly to Marcella. It contained only an address in Bath, and 4 words: "Come alone. Tell no one." Marcella looked up from the letter to find Julian's jaw set in the particular hard line she had learned, in 1 short week, meant he had already decided something dangerous. "You're going," she said. It wasn't a question. "I have to know," Julian said. "Whether it's cruelty or truth, I have to know." "Then you're not going alone," Marcella said, folding the letter with steady hands, though her heart was racing. "Whatever this is, Julian, whoever is waiting at the end of that address, you married me 3 days ago in front of the entire crown. If there is danger in Bath, I would rather stand in it beside you than read about your disappearance in the same papers that already can't stop printing our names." Something in his expression, surprise, and beneath it, a gratitude too large for words, settled slowly into resolve. "Then we leave within the hour," he said. Outside, the London sky had gone the color of old iron, and somewhere beneath it, in a city 3 hours' hard ride away, a woman who was supposed to be dead was waiting with answers that would unmake everything either of them thought they understood about the marriage that had, against every reasonable expectation, begun to feel like it might actually be real. The carriage wheels tore through the mud toward Bath, and Marcella gripped the seat as though the road itself might decide, at any moment, to swallow them whole. Julian sat across from her, silent, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. She had never seen him like this, not the composed duke who silenced grown men with a single raised eyebrow, but a man unraveling thread by thread with every mile that brought them closer to an answer he wasn't certain he wanted. "Whatever we find," Marcella said quietly, "you are not facing it alone, not this time." He looked at her then, something fierce and grateful flickering behind his eyes. "3 years ago," he said, "I would have said I didn't need anyone beside me for anything. I am no longer certain that was ever true." By nightfall they reached the address, a narrow townhouse on a quiet Bath street, its windows dark except for a single candle burning in an upstairs room. Julian's hand trembled, just slightly, as he lifted the knocker. The door opened before it fell. A woman stood in the doorway, older than the portrait had suggested, her dark hair threaded with gray, her face a living echo of the one hanging in Westwood House's gallery. But it was not her. "You're not Isolde," Julian said, his voice hollow. "No," the woman said gently. "I am her mother, and I owe you 3 years of truth, your grace, that I was too great a coward to send sooner." Inside, by firelight, the truth unraveled like a wound reopening. Isolde had not died in the fire. She had survived it, badly injured, her face and body scarred beyond what her family believed a duke's heir could ever be asked to love. Terrified of his rejection, and pressured by a father who feared scandal more than grief, they had let the world believe her dead and sent her abroad to heal in secret. "She never stopped loving you," her mother said, tears finally breaking free. "But she could not bear to have you look at her and see only pity. When she heard of your marriage, something in her finally broke open. She did not send those letters to reclaim you, your grace. She sent them because she needed you to know, at last, that she had never truly left, and because she needed to finally let you go." Julian sat in stunned silence, grief and relief and guilt warring openly across his face for the first time since Marcella had known him. "Where is she now?" he asked, hoarse. "Recovered and remarried in Florence," her mother said softly. "Happy, your grace, truly. She only wanted peace before she could believe in it herself." Later that night, in the small inn where they took shelter before the ride home, Julian stood at the window, silent, the weight of 3 years finally settling into something he could set down. "I owe you an apology," he said without turning. "I married you carrying a ghost I hadn't buried. That wasn't fair to you." "You didn't lie to me," Marcella said, crossing the room to stand beside him. "You told me the truth the moment I asked for it. That's more than most men manage in a lifetime." He turned to face her then, and for the first time the distance he always kept, careful, measured, Duke, was entirely gone. "I did not marry you for love," he said quietly, echoing her own words back to her. "But I find, standing here, that I no longer know how to imagine my life without you in it. Julian, let me finish." His hand rose, gentle, to rest against her cheek. "I have spent 3 years grieving a woman I never truly lost, while somehow finding, in the space of one impossible week, a woman I am terrified of losing before I've even properly begun to have her. His voice dropped lower. Tell me to stop and I will. But I don't want to spend one more day pretending this is only an arrangement. Marcella's breath caught, her heart hammering loud enough she was certain he could hear it. I don't want you to stop, she whispered. The candlelight dimmed low between them, the space closing slow and certain, until there was nothing left unsaid, only the quiet, breathless truth of two people who had found each other by accident and chosen, at last, to stay. The next morning, they returned to London to find the city already ablaze with a different kind of scandal. Lady Cecilia Thorne, furious at being outmaneuvered, had spent their absence whispering to every drawing-room in Mayfair that the Duke of Westwood had abandoned his new bride to chase a dead woman's ghost. "She's twisting it into a betrayal," Julian said grimly, reading the morning papers over a breakfast, neither of them touched, "painting you as a woman married for convenience and discarded within the week." "Then we correct it," Marcella said, chin lifted, though something in her chest ached at how easily the story had turned. "Together." But correcting it proved harder than either expected. Invitations dried up. Old friends grew suddenly, carefully busy. And when Lord Bertram Vane, young, charming, and entirely too interested, began calling on Marcella under the guise of concern for her difficult circumstances, Julian's careful composure finally cracked. "He is not welcome in this house," Julian said flatly, after finding Vane's calling card on the entrance table for the third time that week. "You don't trust me," Marcella said, stung. "I don't trust him," Julian said, closing the distance between them, something dark and possessive moving behind his eyes. "I have watched men like Vane circle wounded reputations before. He does not want to comfort you, Marcella. He wants to be seen comforting you, while the papers still care enough to notice." His voice dropped, "and I find I cannot stomach the thought of any man looking at you the way I have only just allowed myself to." It was, she realized with a jolt, the closest he had come yet to saying the word neither of them had spoken aloud. A few days later, the misunderstanding deepened before it healed. Marcella, desperate to salvage her own name independent of Julian's scandal, accepted an invitation to a garden party without telling him. An invitation, unbeknownst to her, engineered entirely by Cecilia Thorne to draw her into a public confrontation. Cecilia struck with practiced precision, loudly wondering before a crowd of listening guests whether the Duchess had married in haste to escape one scandal only to invite a worse one, a husband still chasing letters from a woman not truly gone. Marcella, cornered and humiliated for the second time that season, fled the garden in tears, and it was Julian, arriving late and finding her gone, who tore through Mayfair in a barely controlled fury until he found her at the edge of the Serpentine, alone, shaking, certain her marriage had already begun to unravel. "I should never have let you face that alone," he said, breathless from searching, dropping to kneel before her without a single care for who might see a duke on his knees in the mud. "I have spent 3 years letting fear and secrecy cost me everything that mattered. I will not let it cost you. Julian, I love you," he said, plainly, finally, the words landing like something long overdue. "Not the arrangement, not the rescue in the chapel. You, your steadiness, your courage, the way you asked for the truth instead of accepting my silence. I did not know I was capable of this until you walked into my life in the middle of your own worst day and somehow made it the beginning of mine." Marcella's tears came freely now, not from grief but from something breaking open, warm and certain, in her chest. "I love you too," she whispered. "I didn't want to. It terrified me more than the chapel ever did. But I do." He kissed her then, there in the fading evening light beside the water, slow and certain, everything unsaid finally spoken in the space between them. By the following week, Julian had done what only a duke of his particular fortune and fury could accomplish. Cecilia Thorne's family found their standing in society abruptly, quietly, thoroughly diminished, while the truth of Isolde's survival, gently confirmed by her own hand in a letter to the papers wishing the Duke and Duchess every happiness, silenced the scandal entirely. Lord Bertram Vane, informed in no uncertain terms by the Duke himself that his calls were no longer welcome anywhere near Westwood House, did not trouble them again. And on a bright morning 3 months later, in the same royal chapel where Marcella had once stood abandoned before 300 witnesses, she and Julian renewed their vows. This time with no scandal shadowing the doors, no absent groom, only a duke who had once been called cold by all of London standing before the woman he had chosen, completely, without hesitation, and without a single secret left standing between them. "For better or worse," Julian said, his voice steady and sure before the same bishop who had once feared his own career was ending in that very chapel. "For better or worse," Marcella echoed, smiling through happy tears. "Though I suspect, Your Grace, we've already survived the worst part." The bells rang out over London, and this time no one was left waiting. If Julian and Marcella's story stole your heart tonight, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the Royal Duke Diaries, and let us bring you into the next forbidden romance, where another duke, another secret, and another impossible love are waiting for you.